Oh, are you trying to click?
Will this work? Will this one work?
Yeah, it should work. Okay. But you gotta, I think you gotta put it in full, try in full mode. Is there an on or off button? Battery's dead.
Thank you, sir.
Council members online, are you ready to roll?
Yes.
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 Oh. I was going to say, 1 out of 4?
There's 4.
We're good.
There's 4.
Right? Call to order this Committee of the Whole meeting. Can we begin with roll call, please?
Councilmember Allison.
Here.
Peterson.
Here.
Connell.
Here.
Shemmers.
Here.
Obrin.
Here.
Mussman.
Here.
Kearns.
Here. All right, our first item, Jenna Bidwell. The floor is yours, ma'am.
Excellent.
Thank you for being here.
Traveled from Wisconsin to be here tonight.
I did.
Thank you.
Don't hold that against me, right?
Did you bring any spotted cow?
I didn't.
Oh, wait, we got to go to the next
Can I
topic.
say that live?
You should have given me a heads up.
No.
Thank you so much for having me here tonight. Purpose really is to provide you with an update of the classification and compensation study for the non-bargaining unit employees, as well as to get some guidance from all of you. There's some key concerns and areas of discussion that we need to highlight tonight, and get some recommendations and guidance to finalize our proposal back to the city. I do have one quick disclaimer I have to put in here, and that's the information I'm sharing is still in draft form. So any changes we make, any of the numbers that you see will shift as we're working towards finalization, but it should represent a fairly close estimate to final numbers. As I mentioned, we've got some key policy guidance that we're looking for some direction on. And so we've worked together with the city administrator and the finance director as identifying some places to start the discussion, but really needing to finalize those recommendations. So we'll want to get some confirmation and direction around the structure design. And I'll walk you through education around the different options available to the city. We also need to talk about what, if any, changes should we look at making to the work week schedule. And again, I'll highlight some areas of consideration for that. And then the last piece is to talk about the implementation. So really, how do you go from where you are today to a new plan moving forward?
And Jen, if you feel comfortable, you can, because you're...
Can you hear me okay?
No, just if you want to be able to do that, just because we want to make sure that people online can hear you too. But you're welcome to do that because we're distance away from you, but it's up to you.
If it becomes a hearing issue, let me know.
Okay.
Okay. If you can go to the next
Yes,
slide
ma'am.
for me, please. So before we get into some more information about your plan in particular, I do think it's important that we take just a few minutes to take a step back and look at kind of the workforce challenges that organizations are currently facing. And so with the pandemic, we find ourselves in a little bit of a unique situation. Matt, if you can move forward for me. This chart here, it might be a little hard to read, but there's some key pieces here that I want to point out. So this graphic is produced by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The yellow line that you see there is a representation of voluntary quits. So that's individuals leaving their jobs, going to other organizations, taking advantage of opportunities. And what you see is this steady climb on the right-hand side. The orange line represents involuntary quits, so layoffs and discharges. And so what you see in the gray in the middle is those two are inverted. So we had a spike of layoffs and a decrease in voluntary quits. That was during the recession of 08 and 09. Okay, so then what we saw for the last 9 years or so was this steady climb in individuals choosing to leave their jobs. Okay, next slide. This is just to put some things in perspective here. What we see now is this huge spike on the right-hand side, and that was the pandemic hitting in the early part of this year. So all of a sudden, we saw this incredible spike in organizations pulling back. Layoffs occurred. Individuals across the U.S. felt this immediate shakeup. In the center, that really, really small blip now was that huge inverse that we saw back during the recession. So what it's telling us is that organizations are kind of in this holding pattern, right? We don't know really what the economic impact's going to be with the recession. What we do know is that it's not hitting, with the pandemic. We know that it's not hitting industries and organizations the same. And so why do we care about this? If you can move to the next slide, what it tells us is individuals leaving organizations tell us that there's some stability in the economy, right? And what we saw was that steady climb just prior to the pandemic. We have a lot of organizations who are in this wait and see. They're anticipating that things will kind of go back to normal. And so what it means for organizations is we need to be positioned to continue to compete for talent. That's the piece that I really wanted to emphasize here. So organizations like yourselves are still moving forward, looking at compensation, ensuring that they're putting themselves in a competitive position to move forward, to be able to attract employees, but also to be able to keep their strong employees as well. Some things that we look at, just to give us some insight into the organization that we're reviewing. In this particular instance, again, this is just within the non-bargaining unit, but we've got almost 60% of our staff that are age 50 or older. And so what it tells us from a planning perspective is you have individuals who are eligible for retirement today, and you have individuals who are eligible for retirement in the next 5 to 7 years. And so what do we have to be doing from an internal perspective, planning perspective? That's knowledge, walking out the door, succession planning. Again, thinking about this from a compensation perspective, we need to ensure that we're setting ourselves up to be able to backfill those positions, that we can continue to attract talent. Same thing then when we're looking at this service profile, again, the same group, we're wanting to see what is that spread. And what we see is over a third of the employees have less than 5 years of experience. So as an organization, we've already experienced some of this turnover. And so in order to keep our employees engaged, in order to keep our employees here, that 5-year window becomes pretty critical. What we see is that organizations who are able to keep employees for the first 5 years or so tend to kind of put their hooks in them, for lack of a better way, and those employees tend to be long tenured employees. So you have this large group, understanding that you have a senior staff of over 50% ready for retirement. All of these things are kind of setting the stage to emphasize the need to have a competitive pay plan to support the organization's objectives moving forward. A little bit of an overview on our methodology. So from a high level, the things that we look at as we're working with organizations is, first and foremost, those center bubbles, right? We want to make sure that we're setting up an organization to have equitable compensation systems, looking at position from position, department to department. We want to make sure that along with setting that internal equity, we're providing you something that's competitive in nature, meets the needs of the organization. And the key piece to that is consistency. So I'll walk you through the specifics of the methodology to achieve that. On the outer ring, those are the things that help plans and organizations kind of continue these pieces moving forward. So the plan that you ultimately design meets the strategic objectives of the organization. We want to make sure that it's something that's fiscally responsible and you can sustain this moving forward. It's not something you're going to outgrow tomorrow. And we really emphasize the need for communication. So at the onset of the project, we provided some communication to staff. Throughout the project, I met with department heads, and here, as we're working through the final steps of the project, we're continuing that communication. High-level overview of the project. So it started with project planning, walking through some of the key decisions that we needed to make at the onset of the project. We did virtual employee orientation, thank you, pandemic, but it was the opportunity to communicate with staff what we needed from them. And so they provided job documentation for us in order to complete the internal analysis piece. In conjunction with the job documentation piece, we went out and collected market data relevant to your organization. That information came back to us. The job documentation came back to us, and we did a job analysis and evaluation process. I'll walk you through the details of that in just a minute. I conducted department head interviews virtually, met one-on-one with each of the department heads, asked them questions about their existing structure, had an understanding of the positions and how they related to one another, asked about compensation concerns, things we should be aware of, are there positions that they're having difficulty staffing or retaining, those types of things. On the far right, the top, that's where we are today. We're here to provide that project update and get some policy guidance. From here, we'll look to present a final report, hoping for adoption, and then there is an appeals process at the end, so employees have an opportunity to have a chance to kind of raise their hand and ask for a second look in situations. So a little bit more about the process of the job analysis and evaluation, and really the rationale for it. At the heart of this process is job documentation. And here are just a few of the key pieces of why this is important. From an HR perspective, job documentation, job descriptions are kind of the vein of our existence, right? The moment you publish them, they're outdated. And so this process becomes a bit cumbersome, but it's really important. And so from an organizational perspective, here's all of the different ways that job documentation can impact your organization. It sets the framework for recruiting, making sure that what you're identifying in the job is really what you need. You're getting the right individual in the door for it. From a performance standpoint, you're making sure that on an annual basis, they're meeting the expectations of the job. There's a whole slew of legal compliance around job documentation and risk management for an organization. And then on the other side of things, employee engagement. Have an understanding of what's expected, but also what are the opportunities for growth and development within an organization. So job documentation is extremely critical in our process, but it's also a really important piece in any organization. Matt, if you could.
Excuse me?
So from an internal perspective, the job evaluation process allows us to develop a hierarchy. So that was what was included with the memo that was provided in advance of today. This process is a formal, systematic process where we can create a hierarchy of the jobs within an organization that are completely independent of the performance of the individuals, which is really important to know, right? So coming in from the outside, I don't know who the individuals are. I don't know what the performance is like. But what we're able to do is provide you with a hierarchy of jobs based on 5 key factors, and I'll walk you through each one of those in a moment here. The job evaluation process was dependent upon the job documentation that we received. So that job documentation was provided from the employees. They're the ones in the roles performing the jobs. It was reviewed by their supervisors. It was reviewed centrally through the finance director and then provided to me. Each of the jobs included in the study went through that same process, and I evaluated each one consistently. The goal through this process is you're able to compare jobs that are otherwise apples to oranges. They may not have relationships that are overly obvious, but by putting them through the same process, we're able to establish that order. Matt, if you could.
Yep, sorry.
Thank you.
We're trying to get, the mayor loves this, but he has to actually go to another engagement with a thing, so.
No problem. So these factors identified up on the screen are the 5 job evaluation factors that we use when we're going through each of the job documentation pieces. So the first one is thinking, challenges, and problem solving. What we're looking at here is what are the types of challenges or problems that each position is responsible for addressing, and what's the required kind of thinking response to be able to solve those problems. The second factor is around decision making. This has 3 subcomponents to it. So the first one is around the judgments, the type of decision, what's the freedom to act that an individual has. We also then want to know what's the extent of the organization impacted by these decisions, and what is the role that the individual plays in the decision-making process? Are they suggesting ideas to others to make decisions? Are they participating in that decision-making process? The third factor that we look at is interactions and communications. This is all about who do you interact with, what's the context of those interactions, and then what's the outcomes on the organization? Who does it impact? Do you control information? Are you setting policy? Are you providing general information? The fourth factor then is around work environment. The 2 subcomponents to this are what are the recognized known health hazards, oftentimes identified through OSHA regulations? And then the second piece are what are the physical demands of the job? What are the physical requirements? And the last one, and I apologize, it's kind of hard to see in here. The last one is around formal prep and experience. This is all about if you were to staff the position tomorrow, what would be the minimum qualifications around education and experience you would require of an individual to be successful in this role? So each of these 5 factors is something that we look at. It's linked to the job documentation that the employees provided us. So the job description questionnaire, it's a little bit more than just a traditional job description. It goes into each of these 5 areas and allows us to evaluate around each of these factors. So getting into a discussion now around the market comparison. So that was the internal process that we went to establish that internal hierarchy. This now we're going to take a look at the external measurement. So what we did was we looked at 23 different cities. These cities were identified in conjunction with the administration here, looking at population, per capita income, as well as the distance from Clinton. So we were trying to find a mix that was appropriate around those different factors. In addition to the municipalities that we've identified, we also utilized the U.S. Department of Labor Bureau of Labor Statistics, it's a mouthful, and also 2 private surveys that we subscribe to, Comp Data and Willis Towers Watson. So what we do, the steps we go to be able to measure the competitiveness starts with taking a look at the internal pay practices. So what we had identified were 35 benchmark jobs. This is the pay related to the existing positions within the organization. So this is current pay of the city. That's what each of those blue dots represent. And what we're able to do is across the bottom of the screen, you see the job evaluation points. So that's related to those 5 factors that we just went through. And then on the left-hand side, you see the current hourly rate of pay. Okay, so what we're able to do is plot each of those positions on the graph, and then we run a mathematical regression analysis that gives us that line of best fit. Okay, that's what that solid black line. That solid black line ultimately will represent just an overall pay practice. Okay, and this is existing pay. If you can go to the next one then. So the second slide then is a measurement of the market for each of these positions. Okay, so it's the same, the same measurements along the axis. So we have the same job evaluation points. Again, so as we went through, we evaluated each of those jobs. It's the job evaluation points. And then on the left-hand side, now this is the median market, okay, or the 50th percentile. So kind of the middle of the market measurement. And what we see is each of those red dots then are formed around that pay line. That pay line, that gray pay line, represents an overall market pay line. Okay, so there's some that pay a little bit above, some that pay a little bit below, but overall we start to see a trend line appear. What we see on the far right with the equation and the R squared, what it tells us specifically with that R squared, what we're looking for is what is that relationship between the job evaluation score and a predictability of pay. So in this instance, 97% of the variance or the difference in pay can be explained through the job evaluation score. So what it tells us is that although not every single position is a benchmark position, where we don't have market data, we can rely on that job evaluation score to place them appropriately in the structure. Okay? So those are some of the pieces that we look at. If you can go to the next slide then. So this slide then, what we're seeing is the comparison of the current pay. So the dark black line is the current pay in comparison to the grayer, I realize it's a little harder to see in here, the grayer line being that market pay line, okay? What I want to point out is this is on the hourly rates of pay, okay? So when we're talking about going and measuring the market, we bring everything down to an hourly rate of pay to make sure that we're looking at things consistently. So what we see is there's quite a bit of overlap on the far left-hand side. And then as that line reaches about the 1/3 to middle, it starts to separate a little bit. So the market tends to pull away. The market's a little bit higher than our actual, okay? Overall, a way that we can measure the competitiveness is by a market index, so where we look at current pay to the market. And what we see is that overall, it's a 98.7% market index, which tells us we're just a little bit behind the market from a pay rate perspective. Okay. So this is where we have to start to get a little bit of feedback here, and I'll share some information and then we'll come back to those pieces that we need some guidance on. But there's really essentially four key policy decisions that go into any compensation study. The first one is really defining who it is that market consists of. Who are we comparing ourselves to? So like I said, we looked at organizations similar to you. And then the second piece then is where in that market do we want to be? Do we want to be right at that median, right in the middle? Do we need to lead? Do we need to lag? And we'll talk about that. The third piece then is in structure design. So what type of pay structure do we want to have? I'll show you some examples. And then that fourth piece, again, is all about How do you get from where you are today to implementing a new system? So there's some things to consider in the design, right? So from an employee's perspective, this really is all about, well, how do I get a raise? How do I earn more money? What does this mean for me? So when we're thinking about the design, that's the employee perspective here. Some other things to consider, there's a practice in place that we're balancing the internal ratings with the market pay. So we don't have a pure market pay system, right? So we don't have a system that we're recommending that is strictly based on market rates. We're going to balance those. We consider whether one plan is appropriate or do we look at multiple plans. In the instance of your organization, it's a smaller group with the non-bargaining units as one. It's likely going to be one plan, but we could explore what it makes sense to have different plans. There's always the need to be mindful of the financial limitations at play when we're talking about the structured design, what makes sense. Kind of getting back to our first piece on, we want to look to something that's sustainable for you. And then it's the policy direction. So thinking about performance and pay for performance and how do those things all tie together. Go to the next slide. So again, the two key pieces around design, the first piece being, where do we want to be competing in the said market? Do we want to be competing right in the middle? I think that's where 89% of organizations say they're going to compete. They're going to take the median. Do we need to lead for some reason? Or financially, do we need to look at lagging? Is there a decrease that we need to consider? And then the second factor is this relationship between pay and performance. So different models can support different philosophies when it comes to this. And we'll get into those different models in just a minute. Regardless of the design of the structure, one of the things that our firm is really intent on emphasizing is, regardless of the structure, you need to make sure that you've got some language and policy in place to ensure that individuals are at least meeting performance expectations to continue to receive pay increases moving forward, right? So there's also that balance of compensation and other benefits, right? So pay is important, but it's not the only factor at play within that employment relationship. So how do we balance pay with some of those other components? And then truthfully, looking at the pay for performance policy perspective, most public sector organizations aren't equipped to have a fully pay for performance system in place. The incentives just usually don't support them. And quite honestly, there's still an ongoing debate, is pay really a motivator, and all of those good pieces as well. So it tends to not be something that most public sector organizations move to implement. This graphic represents really 4 basic pay models. So the first one in red is just a single rate of pay. So for X job, this is the pay rate. Doesn't matter how long you've done the job. It doesn't matter the background. If you qualify for the job, it's a single pay rate. Okay, that's the first model. The second model is a step-based model. So this is similar to the model that you have in place today. In this particular model, you'll see it's 11 steps. The bold number in the middle is CP, it's a control point. That's the relationship to the market. So I'm not going to tell you that it's the market estimate, but it does tie back to that market pay line. So it's a representation of the market. But we balance that with the internal factor as well. So in the step-based model, what we're seeing in this particular graphic is 11 steps of 2.5% increments from the minimum to the control point. That's a 12.5% spread. So the minimum, or you would start somebody on step 1, it's 87.5% of the control point. They'd move equal 2.5% increments up to that control point, representing the 100%. And then it's balanced equally up to 112% up to the maximum. Okay. You'll see it's a little bit narrower of a model. Step structures tend to be a little bit more narrow because of that predictability in pay. The purple model, the third one, is your traditional private sector performance-based model. So in this particular model, you see it's much wider. From the minimum to the control point, that's 20%. So the minimum goes down to 80%. Maximum now goes up to 120%. There is no predictability in movement and no guarantee in movement throughout that structure. It's completely dependent on performance. Okay? And then the last model, the fourth model, is what we call a combination or hybrid model. So what you see is there's the step increments, so similar to the step model. At the onset, 2.5% steps up to a control point, and then it becomes an open range up to the maximum. So what you see in this particular design is, from a philosophy perspective, an organization is making a commitment to get your pay up to approximately a market pay. And then anything beyond what the market is paying for a position is dependent on your performance. And so there becomes a variability factor. Okay? So that's the philosophy behind each of these four different models. So based on preliminary discussions, preliminary conversations, we've proposed this step plan model. So again, it's similar to the existing structure in that it's got, it's a step-based model. Again, we'd put that caveat on that progression from this model would still consist of individuals meeting performance expectations. It's 11 steps, just like in the model that I just showed you on the previous screen. They're 2.5% increments. So individuals would start, new to an organization, potentially on step 1, and they would progress up to the control point by year 6. Okay? So the idea is somebody new to a role coming in, it's an appropriate expectation that someplace in that 4 to 7 years, somebody would be proficient and completely solid in their performance, and paying them at that market rate or so would be an appropriate place to be. And then it continues that progression, again, 2.5% up to maximum. Some things to note in terms of differences between the existing model and this model. So one of the things is actually, it's primarily around consistency, to be honest. So this model, from the progression of control points, so right there at the 100% of that control point, from each grade, so as you move up, it's an equal 7.5% progression. So whereas right now, if you look at your current structure, it varies from 3% all the way up to 26%. I think it averages about 12% overall. So it's varied as you move up your existing structure. This isn't. It's consistent. The other piece around consistency then is in the structure design. So this is, as I said, it's 2.5% equal steps from each pay grade. Doesn't matter which pay grade you're in, it's 2.5% increments. Again, going back to your existing structure, it's 6 steps for each pay grade, and it varies someplace between 4 and 6% increments for each of those steps. Okay, so those are some of the key design differences between the two. So to talk a little bit about that fourth policy piece around plan implementation, there's a couple pieces I want to highlight here. This is where we need to visit this topic around work week. So when we looked at the market comparison and looked at the market competitiveness on pay rates, I said you're behind the market just a little bit. When you build into the factor that your existing staff schedule is 37.5-hour work weeks, what you start to see is you lag the market more substantially. Okay, so when we're thinking about this and we compare somebody earning $20 an hour who works a 37.5-hour work week versus somebody who works a 40-hour work week, what you'll see at the end of the year is a 6.25% difference in pay. Okay, so from a practice perspective here at the city, although everybody's on a 37.5-hour work week, your non-exempt staff, if they work more than that, are being compensated for that. Your exempt staff or your salaried staff, are based on their pay is based on 37 and a half hours, but there's an expectation that they're not working 37 and a half hours. So there's a challenge there, right? There's a discrepancy. So when we think about the pay rates, we're competitive, but if you annualize them, there becomes a challenge from a competitiveness perspective. Go to the next. There's also some challenges that organizations need to be thinking about when we're talking about an implementation strategy. So what are the budget limitations, right? With anything, there's a set amount that we can spend. We also have to balance this notion of fairness versus happiness. So I'll walk you through a couple of examples around that in just a moment. But it's important to know that decisions around implementation should be policy level. We want to make sure that we're having kind of formulaic driven decisions so that ultimately it's applied equitably across the organization. The size of increases may vary. So we'll talk about what some of those thresholds might look like. And for most organizations, I will tell you right now, when it comes to implementing a step plan, most organizations do not have the ability to recognize years of service. So what I mean by that is most times you're not able to place somebody who has been here for 10 years on step 10 of their structure. Financially, it's quite burdensome. So we'll look at some of these pieces. We need to talk a little bit about compression, and we'll talk about different forms of compression here in just a minute. And then the last bullet, really kind of going back to that fairness versus happiness. We have to be careful about exceptions. It becomes a slippery slope. So that's where if we can keep them high level, policy driven, we can help kind of curb some of those. These are just estimates right now. So we needed a place to start. So based off of that proposed structure, here are some places to consider. So for the very first line, this is the most conservative approach. It is simply placing individuals onto the step that provides an increase, whatever that increase might be. So for some individuals, that might be a penny, and for others, it may be more. So this is something to note, understanding that those step increments are 2.5% steps. You could have somebody going 2.49%, or more if they're below step 1. So again, with this initial cost estimate, it's placing people onto the step that provides an increase. So getting them up to the minimum. If they're over the maximum, this doesn't include an increase, and we'll talk about those individuals as well in a minute. The second piece, the second row here, is looking at making an adjustment to the work week expectations. So if we were to make an adjustment and said, for exempt staff, the expectation is that you work 40 plus hours, we'll move that annualized hour work week to 2,080 to get to that 40-hour work week. So that would be the cost with making that adjustment, as well as the first piece of putting people onto the structure, okay? The third option is this one about length of service, and this is where you start to see how it becomes quite costly. And so to place people onto the structure commensurate with years of experience, that's identified in the pink row, so a 9% expense there. Then we have options for kind of setting some different thresholds, and that's what this is meant to look at and kind of spark some conversation around. So the blue option, the fourth one down, is to place people onto the structure that provides an increase, and at least to step 3 if they have 5 years of service or more. So that's where we can start to address some of those compression concerns. And then the last two are just setting some floor or minimums in terms of what people could see in terms of implementing the structure. So the first one is, let's put people onto the structure that provides at least a 1% increase, or let's put people onto the structure that provides at least a 15-cent an hour increase. There's different levers there that can be pulled. Matt, if you can. So there's some pieces around compression that we also need to think about when we're talking about implementation. So there's different types of compression. So New hires to existing staff. So where you have maybe multiple incumbents or individuals in similar roles, when implementing a new structure, and if we implement it simply to get people onto the structure, you may have individuals who have been here for a while on step one, and you go to hire another employee within that role and they're at the same pay rate. That is one form of compression to be considering. You have compression that you need to be mindful of when you have supervisors and subordinates. And so do you have individuals that you're overseeing earning more money than you? This is especially one of those factors that come into play when you have supervisors or leaders over non-exempt staff who qualify for overtime. And then you have the bargaining unit versus the non-union. So you have an existing resolution in place for compression pay for your captains. This is an example of that. So we also have to note that not all compression is necessarily bad, right? So it's a matter of taking a look at it and understanding what it is that's happening. So sometimes it's a matter of, we use the term hoarding, it's not meant to be negative in any means, but sometimes individuals have a more willingness to take on more work. So you'll sometimes have compression pay happen because of that. Situations that are corrected in the near term with a wage schedule. So what we mean by that is perhaps upon implementation, you may have a direct report who's earning more than their immediate supervisor. Their immediate supervisor may have many more steps to grow into the future, where the direct report may be on step 11. So those types of things would be remedied fairly quickly through a new wage schedule. And then the third of those is when you have incoming employees who just have greater skills. That sometimes happens. You may have inexperienced leaders overseeing somebody with a lot of years of experience. It happens, it's understandable. So those are situations where you have a rationale for compression and it doesn't necessarily imply that the system is broken. And then there's ways that you can remedy it. So compression adjustments, like I mentioned, you already have some of those in place. And we'll just want to talk about, is that something that we should continue or should we fix that with the structure? Two things to think about here around implementation is we have some individuals who are over the maximum, and we describe that as being red circled. Okay, so there's 6 individuals within the non-bargaining unit that fall within this category. And essentially it's that their existing pay is beyond the maximum that we've identified in the current structure design. There's different ways you can handle that. So one approach is to do what we call hard circle, where you leave their pay where they are. We're not going to recommend pay cuts, but you leave their pay where they are, and as you adjust the schedule each year, they would eventually fall back into the structure. Option 2 is what we call soft red circle, where their base pay would not change, but as you adjust the structure over time, you may choose to provide them with lump sum payments or bonus type payments so that we're not perpetuating that pay issue. And then the third option is simply to do nothing. You could continue to provide those increases just as you always have, and they would continue to be base building moving forward. So for practical purposes in terms of implementation, we really don't have to make a future decision on this, but we have to decide is how do we want to handle them from an implementation perspective? Should we be providing any increase? Should we freeze them for implementation purposes? How should we handle that? On the flip side of it then is this notion called green circle. And so we have 13 individuals who their current pay is below the minimum or step 1 of the new proposed structure. And the conversation around that is, well, what do we do or how do we fix those, right? So there's 2 possible solutions. An immediate lift would be simply to take them from where they are today and put them on step 1 upon implementation. A second option is a phased-in approach. What I would tell you is for most organizations, this phased-in approach is used because there's financial limitations and we can't afford the first immediate lift. Regardless of how you handle the green circle and the red circle, it's always important to know that we have to be careful of the strategy, right? So we need to make sure that we're thinking through any sort of discriminatory reasons for why these may be existing today. But oftentimes when we think about it from a policy perspective, we can kind of protect ourselves. But also recognizing that there's some employee morale issues around these as well. And so they sometimes require a little bit more delicacy in how we move forward and handle these conversations with staff. So these, circling back to where we started, these are some of the policy discussions and decisions that we're looking for some guidance from each of you on. So if we can maybe work through each one of these and ask any questions, or I'm happy to answer them along the way here as well. But the first piece being around the structure design. Is there feedback around the proposed step structure? Any thoughts?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious on how we end up, or how you end up at the step with, if you call it a hybrid model, right?
Yep.
Versus just performance-based.
The bottom one? I'm sorry, I didn't catch the cap.
Well, I guess your proposal seems to me like it's more of a combination or hybrid, right? And what you're proposing versus a performance-based model.
It is not. It's actually the step-based model. So it's
So you're planning to stay with step?
through initial discussions, that was the initial model, but that's why we're having this conversation.
Yeah, so I guess my question would be, what does administration have, to base off performance in a step model like that? It didn't seem like they would have much leeway at all.
Oh, good question. Okay, so in terms of what type of decisions could be made to recognize high performers on a step model, there's a couple different approaches you could take. So where a traditional step model would be providing typically annual movement from one step to the next, one way you could handle high performers would be to accelerate that step movement. Instead of receiving one step, you receive 2 steps. Alternatively, and what I would most often recommend is that instead of providing 2 steps right away, you actually just make a commitment to look at their performance again in 6 months. So in a year's time, an individual may receive 2 steps, but that you're continuing to kind of incent and recognize that high performance and that they may be eligible for step movement more quickly than an average performer. Does that answer your question?
Can I ask how often we do our performance reviews at this point?
Annually.
But with that said, if you have
So,
an improvement,
on the flip side of that, with the maybe not so high performers, if they're there, they're still going to get awarded steps, essentially, correct? Just by years of service, potentially.
So that's where I would ensure that you build in some policy language there that says you have to be meeting performance expectations to be eligible for step progression. To kind of help curb that.
We are lacking, we are certainly lacking, is that correct?
Yes. Basically, the current model is 6 years. In the first 6 years, you're going to be at step 6,
Regardless.
no matter what you do. And that's what we're trying to fix.
We need to get away from.
Yes. And when we looked at it, basically, Anita and I, along with Jenna, basically takes our 6-step model and stretches it to 11 steps. It still has that in there, but it has the ability for the department head to adjust when they would move or not. And it gets a course correction for where those specific jobs should be placed. And the other reason we didn't jump to the combination model, because we can't afford that at this point. We could get to that over the next maybe 3 to 5 to 7 years as we build, but we got to get this step in first and get this codified to then get us to that port. But it gives us still a little option on the performance base to maybe, like Jenna mentioned, skip a step if this person is just doing awesome based on their job description. And based what they're asked to do, they're going above and beyond that. And it's already clearly articulated that, not being subjective.
Correct.
Completely objective. You've exceeded all your standards laid out. Now we can look at moving you in the model.
That's the other piece that I would always caution an organization on. Jumping to a combination model or performance-based model does require a fairly thorough job around your performance evaluations, and it requires consistency in evaluations. And if an organization hasn't historically been as disciplined around those, it makes implementing something like that more difficult. As Matt had mentioned, it's a great model for something to grow into, but I recommend to my clients that you give yourself at least 2 years to make some evolution around your performance system in order to be able to more appropriately provide pay for performance.
So,
When you were looking at the cities that you listed as your comparables,
Yes.
what were the average incomes of those, I mean, tax income for those cities?
I don't have that level of detail, I'm sorry. I can get that information for you. I don't have it with me today.
Yeah, so, Councilmember Allison, you're looking at what the valuation is, so you know where they are as far as the ability to have the funding? Yeah,
Yeah.
That's a good question.
yeah, that's a very good question.
do you normally work with private companies or do you normally work with municipalities?
Mostly public sector. For myself, our firm as a whole has both public and private.
Okay.
My compensation is with public sector
Okay,
organizations.
because being in public office now, I know that every job that is under the city is under scrutiny out there by every person on the street.
Yes.
Including ourselves, because, you know, we're responsible to make sure things run right. So I like the performance being added in. I really like that, and I don't think it's too much to ask, especially because a lot of our employees have been here long enough that we should be able to expect something from them. So I like that.
I would agree with that, Rhonda. I've always been a merit-based pay fan.
I think most of us that came from the private sector were merit-based.
Yeah.
You got it.
Just so you know, I come from a very unique position when we talk about this, because I was one of them for 37 years, okay?
He was at the top of the scale for like 20 of those years.
Yeah. And so there are many features here. First, I want to say you've given a great presentation here. A lot of my questions that I had coming into tonight, you answered or at least touched on. One of the things that I got like a list of things.
Sure.
One of them is when we talk about compression, you hit it on one line about our relationship to the bargaining units that we have. That has been through the years a significant issue because we are locked in. I don't say locked in, but we have negotiated in our bargaining unit structure that a few years back was significantly changed by the law, where now it is just fee-based or pay-based, where there's no negotiation. So that has a significant issue on what our bargaining units are negotiating now versus what our pay package is that you hit on too about what are the benefit packages that are part of this structure, even though it's not part of this structure. The work week issue is significant from my point of view because that 37 and a half hours a week, that 2.5 hour difference is huge when you start comparing that line that you're talking about going from what our median is to what our actual is. It's very hard to compare when you're talking that. So I'm kind of a proponent of changing that piece just so that it makes it a lot easier to compare going forward. We talked about succession planning. That is going to be huge for us in the next 5 years to 10 years, as you saw when you started talking to our employees. 50% of what you're talking about in 5 years are going to be eligible for retirement. And yes, I retired, and I retired early because of what is out there. So we're going to be having some succession planning issues that we're going to have to include into our structure going forward based on what we just talked about performance-based pay, increases versus I've been here 2 years, I get this. So there's got to be some build in there between, management, which is our number one issue, frankly, is we don't have an HR manager, as a city, so we have internal things that have to happen by our department heads, by our, city administrator specifically, because he's got a big job to get his department heads to do in those performance management evaluation pieces. Once we get some of that issue, we've got that, problem that we have to overcome. The other thing is that we're talking about current job descriptions. What does Matt want in the future? Are we going to change? Yeah. Are we going to change what that particular job is? Are we going to add something to it? Are we going to restructure our internal organization going forward as we are now starting to see that succession planning happening? So we have to, be cognizant of that also. When we were talking about the age of volunteer quits, I think that's going to come forward very soon when we start talking about potential changes in law about what, especially that affects us as IPers. When those things start to change, because that's potential here, we're going to see a lot more voluntary retirements a lot quicker than 5 years if those laws start to change, because I can see where that might happen. The other thing that you talked about very specifically was about annual pay rates versus performance merit rates, that I'm in agreement with everybody said here. Performance has to be part of that structure, and more so in each job it's going to be a very specific set of goals each year that will become part of the performance evaluation. Frankly, that's not been part of what's going on here, currently, that we have to really set straight, I think. And when we were talking about the red circle issues, there's got to be some negotiation ability in there with some of those, jobs that the job description puts it here and the employee thinks that, hey, it should be here. And, having those two different, you call them steps or rates, I can't remember what you had all the letters of the alphabet.
They're grades.
The
Yep.
grades,
Yep.
there you go. So there's going to have to be some negotiation, because I'm sure you didn't talk to all of our bargaining, non-bargaining, employees. So there's going to be some negotiation here, especially when we have, I saw those numbers of people that have been here over 25 years. It's crazy. I mean, I don't know if you've seen organizations like that
Public sector.
Yeah, okay, so.
I mean, it's the model
it's-
itself lends itself to long tenure.
Yeah, so.
Yeah. Well, and the great news on that, Councilmember Oberon, is that the way Jenna did this is those individuals wrote their own job descriptions that were reviewed by their department heads.
Okay.
So they're only getting compared on that chart, not by other people that do other jobs in the city, but by like people and other
like people,
jobs.
yeah.
So
And-
when they have a vision in their mind that I should be at this level, well, this is going to come to be that
Yes, exactly.
appetite suppressant that says, no, you're actually right on line with the others that perform the duties that you described in your job description. Yeah.
And so hopefully, all these pieces, I mean, like I said, I've been through this many times on the other side of this table, but this is one of the more comprehensive pieces that I've ever seen. So I think we're along the right road right here. We just got to now start, really putting some things, in practice that we can, and like I said, we don't have an HR manager. So our HR manager, is basically sitting
We're
here.
going to get Jenna to stay.
Yeah. And so we're looking at, there might even need to be some education pieces going forward of our department heads specifically, and maybe even take that one step further to our division heads that, might need some training on how they're going to effectively supervise their, immediate subordinates.
Absolutely. I'll tell you, with the clients I work with around performance management, there's twofold training, right? It's education to the supervisors on how to provide feedback and measure and objectively identify performance standards. But then it's also providing training to employees. How do we effectively communicate with our supervisors? How do we have those conversations? So I agree. I think there's probably some training needs as well.
Thank you.
So if we did the step model and we did, let's say, an automatic increase with the ability to freeze it if we ever needed to financially, you could make that still merit-based, and the department gets, let's say, 2.5% across the board. And those that don't meet expectations get no raise. Those that exceed expectations get maybe 4%. And those that are middle of the road or doing what's asked but not doing anything else get the 2.5%, but it all equals out to a 2.5% in that department, period, across the board. And they have to break it up according to merit.
Yeah, again, I would encourage that the system for performance evaluation strongly be reviewed to ensure that it can adequately identify those high performers and that there's consistency. But yeah, absolutely, you can still use a step-based model to recognize performance differences.
And what we talked about too is you just have to be able to show why you didn't move. Right? So when you get into counseling and saying these are your performance objectives, you didn't meet them, you have to be able to show them why they didn't. Yep. Yep. Yep.
And hopefully, I would also encourage that those conversations not be just taking place once a year, right?
Yeah.
We shouldn't be waiting
Continually.
until the end of the year to say, hey, guess what? You're not going to get your step progression.
No, the council reminds me weekly. Bi-weekly, sorry.
So just in kind of keeping the focus on those points that we need clarification on, comfort with the step system as long as there's some language around relating it to performance and meeting expectations. Is that fair? The second piece then around the work week and scheduled hours. I mean, you've identified that it really does come kind of down to that being competitive, right? And being able to continue to attract as you need to, and thinking about that succession planning piece and being able to go out and compete.
Well, being able to work 37 and a half, or where I used to work was 35 hours a week, that was an attraction as well.
Sure.
So you can't take that away from, some people like that because it works for their kids pickup, or they just don't want to, they want an 8-hour day period. They don't want 8.5 or 9 hour, including their lunch hour. So I don't think that being under with a lesser hour per week is a terrible thing, but I don't think we can split it and do 50% for one and 50% for the other. So if we decide to go 40 hours a week, then it's going to have to be across the board, and then they're automatically going to get a raise there, not a raise, but a higher end of the year salary. But I don't think 37 and a half hours a week is a terrible thing at all.
I mean, I agree. I think there's pros and cons to any of those schedules. I think the point of differentiating between the exempt and non-exempt point at this junction is that your non-exempt staff are being paid and compensated today for hours over 37 and a half, regardless. So instances where they have additional work that needs to be done, they're compensated.
Look around the room, Rhonda. Me, Pat, Lisa, Matt.
Josh.
Not Matt.
Josh.
Josh. Well, Josh went home.
Yeah. Did he?
These are people that our annual salary is based on 37.5 hours hour work week.
If 37.5 is the base, anything above that would be overtime pay, wouldn't it not?
I don't get overtime.
No,
Not for
not for
exempt.
salaried, but
People don't get overtime.
No, for non.
yes,
For non,
yes, ma'am.
correct. And that's the way that it, well, actually, the way that it works now for non-exempt people, so say my office, our work hours are from 8 AM to 4:30 PM, and they take an hour lunch. So if they are working a 37.5 hour work week, if they work 38.5 hours for a week, they get paid for that additional hour. And if they work 41.5 hours in a week, then they get paid overtime for 1.5 hours. They get straight
Did you
up to
guys,
40.
council members online, did you hear that? Because it's a good,
Yes.
okay.
So being exempt has perks on its own.
It was a little quiet, but
Okay. She's in the back row.
Whatever what Anita said
Yeah,
first,
and-
because I think that is important to hear that.
Yeah, Anita, can you come up? Sorry.
Sorry, Jenna. No worries. I was just trying to give Councilmember Kearns a visual of what a 37.5 hours. So I pointed out myself and Captain Cullen and our city clerk. Our salaries are based on a 37.5 hour work week. But I can tell you I didn't come in at noon today to offset that I'm still here at 7 o'clock. So, but there are positions, and I'll use my office as an example. Our hours for City Hall are 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. My people take an hour lunch break, so they work 7.5 hours every day, times 5 days is 37.5 hours a week. We're not suggesting that that schedule changes. We're suggesting that that's their schedule, and they're scheduled employees. They're non-exempt. You understand the difference between that?
Yes, I was a manager, Anita.
Okay, good. So if somebody in my office works 37.5 hours a week, they get what they're expecting for an annual salary. If they work 38.5 hours in 1 week, they get paid for that additional hour. If they work 41.5 hours a week, they get paid for the 2.5 hours between 37.5 to 40, and then they get overtime for the hour and a half that's over 40. That make sense?
Yes.
So my only point to that was people become exempt because generally they have a higher position. And there are perks that can come with that. If you have to go to the dentist, you can take off and go to the dentist. And generally you don't have to dock your time and you don't have to make up the hour. You know, you're going to get paid for it regardless. So there are perks that come with that. So your salary can be based on 35 hours, but you have to work until it's done when you're exempt, period, right? I mean, that's just the way it is. So the non-exempt people, do we have enough work to keep them busy for 40 hours a week if that's the route that we decide to go?
That change in the schedule has not been included in the dollar figure.
Okay.
Yeah, so Miss Anita said that change in the schedule has not been included in the dollar figure.
To take that a step further, you make a good point. So when you're talking about adjusting non-exempt staff's schedule, if it's not something you're currently utilizing today in terms of hours, you have a valid question in asking is there work to be done, or do you end up with an overage, right? So that's the difference between looking at the non-exempt and looking at the exempt. The assumption is with the exempt is they're already working over 40 hours. So the idea is that you're changing that annual calculation to be more competitive. That's the reality. Is there any guidance in terms of things we should be looking at or calculating in terms of implementation around the work week?
Well, like I said before, I'm for changing it. The part that I always got into just hurdles with is the supervisor is working 37.5 and their subordinates in the bargaining unit are working 40. And that's where the hurdle comes in. Now, understandably, it's not a big hurdle, and it's certainly not going to change, any big pieces. But certainly, that's something to significantly consider.
And that honestly is one of the issues around the compression pay, right? So when you're
Yes.
looking at the non-bargaining unit to the bargaining unit where you have those supervision responsibilities, one is based on 40 hours and one is not. And so you're complicating that compression pay issue as well.
And every time let's call it the base, goes up, that compression issue gets smaller, every time.
Thoughts on this?
You've hit on all my topics. You took all my words from me, so
We're waiting for someone to say, Anita, which one can we best afford?
Anita, which one can we best afford?
Here she comes.
Do we have numbers? Is Anita walking up? Sorry.
Yeah, she is. She's walking up.
Okay. My quick question was, do we have numbers, what a scenario would be moving those employees to a 40-hour work week, and what that would do for us? It sounds like there's a couple council members out there that would almost kind of like to see that, so do we have numbers to support that?
Well, Jenna has the number here in purple. So the step that provides an increase to everybody that might not fit onto a step where their current pay is, plus adjust exempt to an expected work week, which we're just saying is 40 hours a week, is $178,042. Is that an annualized number?
Yes.
That's an annualized number. So one thing that we haven't talked about is, I think when the pay increase for non-bargaining was put on hold, we talked about making it retroactive to July 1st. I mean, that's something we could do, or we could look at implementing it January 1st, and then it would be, say, half of that number. The amount that we had budgeted for in the FY21 budget was, shoot, I thought I wrote
75?
It's not 75. It was 75 for the general fund, but there's other funds that are in this.
Gotcha.
So it's 89,000. Yeah, it's like 88,450. And if you took some money, if we're going to adopt this structure that includes the compression pay for the captains and not making it be an end of the year reconciliation and then cutting them a check, that they would just get it equally through the 24 pay periods. There's money there. So in total, we have about $140,000 to cover whatever you would choose. Did that answer your question, Councilmember Connell?
Yeah.
Can they see this,
My
Mayor?
big missing
Can they
item is
see
not
this?
That purple line there. So that is just going to be those exempt workers at this point. That increase is
No.
4.8% just for them.
It includes a step placement for everybody and then an adjustment for just exempt. Yep. I should say a step placement for everybody moving onto the schedule. Again, there were 6 who would be over the max.
Yeah, Jenna expound on that a little bit. Like if somebody's currently at $25 an hour.
Can you pull up the proposed schedule for just a quick second? So I get this is hard to read, but I'm going to just pick on the bottom row E there. So if somebody is currently earning $16.14 an hour, to place them onto the schedule that provides an increase, they would be placed at step 2, which is $16.59. Okay. Scenario again, if somebody is currently earning $16.12 an hour, in that particular example, they would move to step 1, receiving $16.13 an hour. Does that make sense to everybody? Mm-hmm. So if somebody on that same row, let's talk about the other end then. If somebody is currently earning $20.75, They would continue to earn $20.75. They would be off of the schedule. We're not recommending a pay decrease, and they would stay there until you decided what you wanted to do with those red circles. So those were the assumptions that we used when we were building out some of those estimates.
So I guess what we're looking for at 7 p.m. on the eve before Veterans Day, with a couple more things to go, is the council's direction for confirmed structure. I thought I heard you guys say step structure, which would be 11 steps. What if any changes should be made to the work week? I talked about the 40 hours, but as Councilmember Kearns brought up, we'd still have the ability to have folks at 37.5 hours, and that's what they'd work. We'd still have that availability. And then basically what type to implement, and we're looking at the purple piece, maybe, if with the $140,000 that we have available, but it would start January 1st. So that means that we actually would pick up some steam for what we did not provide to the non-bargainings back in July 1st. So that's why when you look at this purple piece here, it seems like not everybody's getting a 4.82, but remember, we left 2.37 in the dust because we didn't give that to them. So this would actually then get them on the right steps, even that all out, fix the compression piece, but we're still about $38,000 short. But if we start it, as Anita said, it's annualized, so we have the dollars now to start at 1 January, and then we put it in the budget, which is coming up for budget season, starting July 1st.
So just one more clarification. The chart that we saw with the little boxes going up, that was an hourly rate.
Correct.
And we were just under the national, or whatever, the Iowa. What was that?
Your market comparison. Is this what you're referring to?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
So this is, the black again is your current pay. The gray is that target market that we had identified.
Okay.
At
so-
the 50 percentile range. Okay?
Yes.
That's important to
Yes.
note, because we looked at 75, we said no to that, we brought it back to 50, because that's very important, because as Jenna mentioned, it's 80%.
89% of organizations
Are
choose
at
to be
50%. So
Right,
this goes back to that core thing, when people make comments on the street,
Yeah.
those comments will mean nothing, because we did the study through this great organization to show that we're right in line and we're behind on some areas. Remember, we had,
Well, communication will have to help with that.
yes, ma'am.
Right, okay. So, right, okay, so then my,
Another thing, isn't it, our valuations, that comes into play also.
Yes, most definitely.
Tax dollars, as we go through, if we're increasing, I don't see a problem here.
right.
Well, and as we don't know until the December time period, but what we do know is we have the funds available to do this. Valuation will come out, as you guys know, prior to December 31st, and then we can start looking at July 1st at FY22.
So let me just clarify
Yes, ma'am.
then. So back to the purple.
Yep.
That is the $178,042. That is going to include giving the exempt people their salary increase up to 40 hours a week,
Yes.
right?
Yes, ma'am.
And then that is going to bring our hourly people up to whatever the dollar was on that other chart. And then we're going to start looking at performance equations, because I really think that we have to bring the performance in
Yep.
at some point.
We're going to bring performance in, it's in right now. We're
Okay.
going to do that, but as far as when you look at the performance merit pay down the road, we're not going to do that quite yet. We could do it with some step movements, but that's that chart that we need to work towards to get to, and we just
Right, but
financially.
we need to put a timeline around that.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I'll
Is there a
motion,
standard evaluation form?
Yes, we have a standard evaluation form.
I mean, if we can put, if we can put a timeline around that, I would motion.
No, I've not reviewed the performance, if that was the
No,
question.
yeah.
I've not reviewed the performance tool.
Yes, I have a question.
Okay, no, sorry.
Yep. But we could certainly have her do that.
I'm happy to.
Yeah, when I say standard, we have one that we probably need to make more better as a standard. We have a good template, because one of the first things as I got here 4 years ago was, from where I came and grew up in the Army, is everybody knew their task and purpose. And that wasn't always clear. And so that's something we've been working on every year to get better. And now this will even be better, because in the non-bargaining piece, they actually helped write what they were. So now we know what our standards of effectiveness are, a measure of effectiveness, and I think based on what Councilmember Connell brought up, I think we could have you take a look at that, see what others are out there, and then we could maybe make a new and improved one for across the board.
Absolutely.
Well, based on the salary ranges that you showed and the job descriptions, will that work well for the evaluation forms?
Yes, I think if
And are we evaluating based on the job description?
you should be, you
Yes.
should be evaluating based on the standard of the job, yes. And that should be what's captured in the job documentation.
Thank you.
So here's what I would say.
Yes, ma'am.
I would say that I would be prepared to move this forward if we can put some sort of performance evaluation around it, starting July 2021. And I will also mention that I think a good way to start that performance is to have every single person that is non-exempt evaluate themselves after the first of the year so that you get a feeling where you think they are.
Got it.
Based with a performance review that you do on the current documentation.
Yep. So basically, they understand completely what their tasks are, where they think they are right now with
Yes.
those, and then what their goals and stuff are moving forward to meet
Yes.
those metrics going
Yes.
forward. Okay?
I'll second that.
Sounds like you have a motion in a second, and I think I'm now attending since the mayor did dinner.
Yes, the mayor pro tem. Yes.
Sounds like, there was a motion in a second, and we'll have, any more discussion on this.
Yes, sir.
I can't see everybody, so
Oh,
jump in. if you
here.
do.
All good.
Okay, if not, I do have a piece of clarification. Could you scroll back to that slide?
Yeah.
That had the different models on it for me, please?
You bet. Are you still seeing the PowerPoint, Councilmember Connell?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
In which one did you want to see the
It had like
The pay
five
structures.
different options on it, for the, performance base, the steps.
This one?
The
current steps that we have
Nope.
now,
The pay
one, two,
models.
step, and then
Which one?
I think
Go
it's
back
up.
to the front. Keep going, keep going. That one.
Oh, right here.
28.
Yeah, that one right there. So from what I'm understanding, further on here, but you're basically saying that, Jenna, if we do that 11-step base model, we can incorporate some performance, similar to what, council, member Kearns is asking for and what I do support, but we probably won't be able to make that performance-based model work right away because it would be such a large of this, of a switch base, and we would need to gradually work into that over several
Yes.
years, probably.
Yes. And I'll be honest with you. So Wisconsin, just to give quick background here, Wisconsin went through something similar to all of you with the legal changes. When we went through that back in 2011, and organizations like yourself were having these same conversations. Should we be moving and implementing performance-based models because we haven't historically had a relationship between pay and performance? And most organizations did not jump to pay for performance models. There are a few of our clients who do have them, and there's challenges around them, right? So I caution that progression. If you're really considering a performance model, I think movement from a step-based model to that bottom structure, that combination or hybrid, is an excellent transition. Because what it does is it still provides a commitment from an organizational perspective to get people to a quote-unquote market rate or close to a market estimate. But what we're saying is pay beyond the market would truly be conditional upon merit pay and that variable pay. So I think if you're thinking, what's that next couple of years goal, a combination plan may be a good direction to move in, and the step-based model that you're considering is a good transition to it. It would support the future growth to eliminate those steps on the upper half and open that range up to 120%.
Okay. So really, Councilmember Kearns, it's really, if that's something you really want to push for, I would say that would be something you want to look at, down the road at maybe another strategic planning session after we make some changes to this, our current structure.
I would agree with that.
Okay.
So do I need to change that motion?
I think it's still
I think
good.
we're still okay to move forward.
Because that evaluation stuff now.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, and I think as long as we're still incorporating the performance metrics in there, which we somewhat already have, I think that's okay. So, again, I think I would just want to maybe make a note in your file that you want to bring this back up at a future date, just to look at that down the road.
Gotcha.
You can only see me anyway.
Okay.
Okay, so, any other discussion? No? Anybody in line? No? Okay. Roll call.
Councilmember Allison.
Yes.
Peterson.
Yes.
Connell.
Yes.
Shemmers.
Yes.
Oberon.
Yes.
Mussman.
Yes.
Kearns.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. That was very good.
Thank you. Can I extract my?
Yes, ma'am. Here, let me close this out for you.
Thank you.
Item 2,
Thank you, Jenna.
Are you going to roll with this?
Yes, sir.
All right.
I just got to see, we're going to have I need to see. Yeah, so next piece here, I was just texting, there's supposed to be a call-in today. We do have Chris Ailes here again. Thank you, sir. Oh, John, are you online?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, great, great. Yep, so I just kind of wanted to set the stage, and then I was going to turn the phone over to you. The council members have seen Chris Ailes' plan. We call him Developer 1 because he was the first one in. They've kind of went through some of the objective criteria that they're looking for from Mount Pleasant, and I'd really like to take this opportunity to have developer number 2, which would be you, John, to kind of give an overview of what you're looking at for Mount Pleasant.
I was planning on building 7 or 8 upper-end rental units. This would be privately funded, not a tax credit project, and I think I've shared the blueprints with some of the guys, but at the council, just kind of looking for some help to see what the council and the city can do for me and the utilities, and we got to decide on the road, and those are the kind of the holdups on my end is depending on if I can get some help from the city on those points.
Yeah, so as you guys know, as with any development, there's the ability to do tax rebate for public infrastructure. That would be what's the appetite for the council for if John were to build the streets to the city engineer standard as well as the storm and the sewers, and then have those turned over to the city to maintain and plow, et cetera. As well, there could be a structure built for tax rebating those public infrastructure items, just like we did with several other developments in town.
Yeah, so I'm kind of on the fork in the road here, which way to go, and if we want to have that all on private and maintain it, and obviously be less of a standard for the road and the sewers, or do it to the city specs, but then would we be able to get some help from the city on that?
Yeah, and I say that the form of help is the tax rebate. So basically, the valuation that you would increase on there is what we would then work with you on a development agreement to outline those pieces and parts.
Correct. So that's what I'm looking for, some information from you guys to kind of help me proceed. And I'm sure Mr. Ailes has probably the same questions.
Well, in regards to developer number one, Chris Ailes, he actually is putting in all the infrastructure and it's going to be private. So the road he's putting in and the storm sewers and the sewer are going to be private based on his plan currently.
Okay. Fair enough.
Yep. And I think as the council, go ahead, John.
Excuse me. We were also looking at taking our entrance off of that Ice Peak Road in lieu of dumping it onto Bluff, just because we kind of thought that was a safety hazard. And I think we could decrease our rate of incline there to dump it onto Ice Peak as opposed to dumping it onto Bluff.
Yeah, we support that 100%. Chris, look at the same entranceway as well. We're excited because as we look at the renovations over the next 3 to 5 years, because we didn't get our build grant, for Bluff, we would actually curb and gutter that area that's now currently a driveway off of Bluff. And we'd look at, I think our discussion for both developer 1 and 2, we'd see the primary road in by Ikes Peak Road as well as the utilities would actually come down the right-of-way of that to Ikes Peak Road. In particular, the sewer then would connect in down Ikes Peak Road to Bluff where the manhole is.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think the only other few differences were, I think that you were designing some homes with garages, because I know that Councilmember Kearns had brought up the garage aspect. But that's...
All of them.
Yep.
Everybody wants a garage.
Gotcha. Yeah, so really for the council members, I'd just really like to have you, if you have specific questions for John or Chris as well, but then kind of to help you guys make your decision on what you would like to see moving forward. Because as we talked a little bit to the council members, instead of bringing the purchase agreement for Chris right now and spending legal fees, we want to make sure you guys are satisfied with the way we're moving forward and do the correct. And then at this point, you guys could give us the direction then to go and seek out that legal piece to then get things moving via development agreements and also purchase orders. And meanwhile, too, Jason Kraft actually, with the help of our city clerk, was able to get a hold of Mel Pinza DNR. We're able to get $25,000 that we'll pay half to mitigate the asbestos. So as you look at what the price of the, what's that?
That helps.
Yeah. So when you look at the topic there is, we put the fair market value at $130,000, but we took $20,000 off for demo. But I think also either developer, based on what they plan to do, is we could have adjustments in that price. So we'd be willing to discuss that too, based on moving forward. But just want to throw that into loop. We'd probably be sending about, I think it's about $12,000 that we'd put in there that's a big piece that they don't have to mess with, because once you mitigate the asbestos, then they can just tear that stuff down and take it right to the landfill and not have to pay that cost.
So surprise. John, this is Councilmember Kearns, and one thing I do like about your plan, I believe, is that you're considering market rate instead of low to moderate income.
Correct.
Okay. I've always said that, so that's no big secret. The other thing I like when you think long-term about John's, and Chris, I saw yours, and I have no problem with what the things look like. But in the long term, if Mr. Carlson decides to sell, you can sell those as individual homes on lots, and you still have a neighborhood. You don't have, and it would take a long time to get here, but you don't have a Miller Ridge. And I do like that.
I agree.
And I like the garages. I did bring that up. I'm sorry.
I guess 2 questions. Well, I had 3, but I forgot what the third one was. So maybe I'll remember in a minute. Timeline and purchase price of the property.
Yep. So with the timeline, Chris is going to be waiting for a decision that would be around the August time period for the low-income tax credits. John, as a developer number 2, what's your timeline?
30 to 60 days.
Gotcha.
We got winter coming around the corner, but we could do demolition if we don't get snow. That would actually be great work if it wasn't, full of snow and that we do have a road up there. The road would probably be number one, so we could make it a little bit safer. So we dig in the road at first and then start demoing the homes shortly after that.
Yeah, and so right now, purchase price for the option agreement that Chris did, he had $110,000 down. And for developer number 2, what were you looking at for the purchase price, John?
I was less than that. I was going to be in the $40,000 to $50,000 range, guys.
One of the questions I've got for Mr. Ailes, what kind of guarantee does the city have that these won't be turned into a tax-free shelter, basically? I think, wasn't Washington, isn't that right now in kind of a tax-exempt status?
This is Chris Ailes. Washington is subject to a development agreement, and so it is assessed, and then we receive a portion of that increment back for a period of time. And I believe one of the things that was discussed and implemented into that development agreement to ensure that the project didn't become tax exempt at the end of the TIF development agreement was that we would not transfer it to a nonprofit, and we could make that same commitment here.
Gotcha.
And that's one of the biggest things I think council needs to also consider, just because we certainly wouldn't want any kind of development that we're hoping to get on the tax rolls turned over into a nonprofit to avoid property taxes if we're trying to grow our base. So.
Yeah, and on the topic of
Both developers. Well, I mean, the first developer, number one, I guess, if that commitment could be there, that is good. The second developer, I think, is something that really wouldn't be doing anyway since it's all market rate paid. So wouldn't have that issue.
And just to be cognizant of it, we'd have to also figure out, on the little matrix I gave you as you kind of rank and stack them is, what is the tax piece moving forward? There's two parts here. Is what's the length of time for the tax abatement or tax rebate? But then also is, if John does public roads, we just picked up a new expense. So we're going to have that to maintain, that storm sewer and sewer to maintain, as well as to plow. Whereas in the house, so you kind of have to balance that as well, because in the developer one, Chris is going to basically make it private where they take care of it, sort of like where a couple of you guys live. And that's just one less expense that we don't have to take on. We talk about all the time that we have 151 miles of roads. Do we want to have another quarter-mile road or mile road that would be looped around at Mount Pleasant? So that's one aspect. And then really just getting to the crux of what would that tax abatement or rebate be? So on one hand, we could talk about tax abatement or tax rebate for developer one based on the project, because the evaluation that he rises up over a certain period of years, we can give some rebate back. City taxes, not the county and the school, but city taxes. Over here, though, we're talking about rebating for public infrastructure that gets done for a certain amount of time that John's going to need to be able to recoup his money. So when we just did Riverstone, that was $1.2 million for that public infrastructure. So that had to be 10 years to get that money back to him, where we won't see the city tax portion of that for 10 years. So at what point do they both hit on the taxes, and then where are we incurring more expenses along the way? Because they're both really, really good projects. They really are. And the reason we brought it back to Cow is because we're actually in a good position to actually have an opportunity to have two great developers and then to be able to decide on those pieces. And that's why I was trying to make it as objective as possible as we go forward. Where you put your weight is okay as far as when you evaluate them, but one thing we talked about is we do have a risk. We have to wait. We have to make sure that Chris comes through with getting the federal. But he is, as he stated, he's been doing this for a long time. He's very competitive right now with this project being in this track that it's in. And then we'd have to wait a while for that, versus John would start now. But then once again, we don't know yet with John until we get to a development agreement stage of what he's willing to, if he's going to make it private or public for roads, what he's going to be looking back to get rebated back for taxes as well. So it's it'd be a great college exercise to go through, not necessarily life, because it's tough, because I wish both of them could share the space and get it done.
One question I have when we were talking about the valuation going forward, the 30 to 50 for developer one, the 7 to 10 for developer two, the way that I read the information is they're going to be approximately the same valuation when it's done.
Yeah, well, if you stick at 30 and you stick at 10, yes, they would be. But if he actually goes and starts to do 50 of them, then his valuation is probably going to double for developer one. Chris.
We've looked at the numbers since I was here a few weeks ago, and I can tell you that we will, in all likelihood, be closer to 40, but probably not get to 50. That's our sense of the market.
And approximately per triplex or the individuals, what would you rack and stack that as for a dollar amount?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So when we look at the houses, we were saying like $200,000 valuation per house, but and I didn't want to say triplex, but you could, my math at this time of night. But overall, what you think with 40 units being built, what would that approximately valuation, just say for one of the units, and we can do quick math. Not to put on a spot, because we still have to have the assessor come and do his thing, but.
Yeah, I don't know that I can give you that number off the top of my head.
Because originally we put 30 units, we put 1.5 for 30 units. So if we keep it that same model and add 10 more, would be about right, about 2 million?
That sounds about right when I think about the minimum assessment agreements we have on similar projects with about 40 units.
Gotcha.
And then the other question that I had.
Maybe also just consider is what we have for appetite versus, the low to moderate versus grade. I know we have gone through this path the last several years, and we do have quite a bit of LMI out there. And, that it's hard when you're trying to track people if that's really what you have available. We've shown that we've had a need for the market rate, so that's the other side of it.
Yeah. Chris, did you want to go over kind of, I know you sent it to a couple council members, I don't know if everybody got it, but like how the percentage breakdown and where we're at?
Yeah, again, I can't recall those numbers off the top of my head, but the big picture is that, let's say we went with 40 total units. I'm fairly confident that our model has 10% at market rate. So you've got 4 units, straight market rate rents, and no income restrictions. Of the 40, 10%, or 4 of them, would be market rate. And I believe the balance gets split about half 30 to 40% and half at 80%. We're pretty close. And so if we take half of 35, 36, so what, 18? You're going to have 18 units, give or take, off the top of my head, that will be at 80% of the area median income. And I think I've shared with you what those rents are at 80% of the median income. And I'm fairly confident that the market rate rent is below that number. And so effectively, the 80% units and the market rate units are all effectively at market rate. And so out of our 40 units, we're going to have close to half of them at market rate.
For 55-year or older?
50, yes.
If 55 years or older, folks, yeah. They're all doing their calculations. I can feel Councilmember Alice and Councilmember Peterson and Connell are writing on their tablets at home. I can tell. We can't see you, but I know it.
And then the other question, when we were talking about the length of the TIF that we would have, that would be a negotiation point of the development agreement.
Yeah, well, it'd be good to know going in beforehand
yeah.
for you guys to make your decision, but that's an important part, and I think Chris has hit mine for his.
Yeah, we've done this enough. The development agreement that we would be looking for on this project would look very much like the development agreement we looked for on Washington School.
And it's really back to John as far as, you know, if you end up doing the road and the sewers as public infrastructure, what would you look back for that? And then additional years after that, would you be looking for rebates as well to assist in the return on your investment?
Looking at it just because of the increase of the cost and your comment earlier about, maintaining it, I'm kind of leaning toward doing it privately.
Gotcha. So then for as far as when you look at this, like with the Washington Middle School or with Chris in the past, we look at 10, 15, 20-year different things. Have you thought through that, what you'd look at for tax rebate for you?
I would think 5. I was kind of comfortable with the 5 years.
Okay. Gotcha.
What are you guys offering?
Connection to our sewer. No, I think. Well, we've started. The last couple of the council has had me start at a 10-year mark. We did that with a couple projects at the rail park where we start at 10-year at 50% for the negotiations. That's where we go in at.
Okay.
Yeah, and how you do it's kind of weird, but how you kind of do it is once you get to where your valuation is, not the land, but basically the valuation that you increase. So say you get to 7 or 10 homes and that valuation above whatever the land gets assessed for, not what it's sold for. Then we look at that and there's a percentage, and we can kind of show you, Chris and I in the past have worked through this, but show you it's not 100% of those taxes come back to you. It's going to be based on the, once you take out the schools part and some of the county pieces, it's just the city part.
Sure.
Yep.
John, are you looking at, what's the, this is Kearns again. What is the acreage up there?
8.67 acres.
So are you looking at putting these all in one section, or are you looking at like half-acre lots for these places? Or bigger?
And I had a picture and I didn't put it up there.
Matt didn't bring his picture, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I might be able to find it though.
Yeah. It might be 8 acres, but it's certainly a tough piece of property to develop. Pretty impressed that Chris can get that all squeezed in there. We certainly have some elevation changes, and then we have some drop-off. So we started at 7 units at about, they're going to range from 11 to 1,200 to 1,500 square feet, and we were comfortable with the 7 to 8. We thought we could get the duplexes up on top, and we might be able to get that number up to 10 or 12. But more than that, I think they're going to be really tight in there.
Are those based on decent-sized lots though, John? Like if down the road you would have to, sell and make them single-family units?
You bet. But on that 8 acres, that 8 acres is not all able to be built on.
Right, yeah, we've all taken our trips through there. All right, thank you.
It's going to help you up the tree.
Oh, we don't like talking trees.
Unless you want to donate to the Reforest to Rebuild program.
Okay, I got my plug in.
Hey, it was on the front page of the Lighthouse.
And we're up to $4,400.
Does the council have any more questions for either developer 1 or developer 2?
Yeah, man, you there?
Yep, we can hear you. Council.
I guess really for both, but it sounds like Mr. Ray was going to go all private. Is that correct? I know the road, but did that mean sewer? Mr. Clausen, I think, was still contemplating that too. I just the sewer side of it for both of them was interested in how they're going to do that.
Yeah, so developer one, Mr. Ale, he's going to actually do all private sewer and roads in storm sewer out to Ikes Peak Road and then down to Bluff. And then that's where John had just mentioned maybe looking at doing the roads private. And before the meeting, I had a conversation with John about the fact he knows that the sewer most likely has to be, just like developer one's doing, has to be all replaced because the only fact we know is the last house is like where my cursor is. It's actually underneath the trees that actually was there. That's how we started this path down to where we are today because they weren't paying their sewer bill. So we know that that has a sewer, but it's probably 75 to 90 years old connection just because that house is about that old. So we right now are under the assumption that all this would have to be redone and brand new to be then connected to Ikes Peak and then down to Bluff.
Yeah, okay, that's as far as function, mine and my excavator's function was kind of that, we were just kind of hoping that we could buy on something up on the hill, but we kind of assumed that that was probably not gonna happen.
Well, the good news is you got a big hill, so everything runs downhill. So,
But you gotta cross it.
yeah.
Would that be into the First Avenue? Would run into the First Avenue sewer then, Matt?
Yeah, it would actually go down Bluff, and I think it actually hits Second Avenue South and heads towards the river and then down to the RWRF.
Okay.
What would be the average size as far as square foot and how many bedrooms for the houses?
Number one or two developer?
Number two, you're up.
Half of them are gonna be 2 bedrooms, and the other half are gonna be 3 bedrooms.
You blanked out a little bit on the first half.
Hey, Ronnie. Oh,
Would be 2 bedrooms, and the second half would be 3 bedrooms.
Square foot.
The single bedrooms would be in the 1,100-1,200, and the other ones were gonna be 1,500 to 1,600.
too many of the creaky chair.
Matt, you sent us a scoring, kind of a matrix. Is that something that after this information, I'm not necessarily sure we need an action out of this right now, but if the council wants to score that, or maybe they already have, I think I went through it again when you sent it, but is that something that you want to gather back from council?
I just think it's a great decision-making matrix to help out because, you know, we all have our personal opinions, and I think, you know, both developers do a wonderful job. But I think it comes down to is, you know, how does the city minimize the risk, and then what are we looking for to where that's going to be not only next year but then years to come. So, I mean, we could look at, as Mayor Pro Temp, we could look at maybe taking those and have everybody, all the council, rack and stack them and score them and turn them in. And then we could basically get back to both the developers. We do have a little time and space, I think, right? Yep, sir. We got Chris coming back to the mic.
I feel like we do. Okay.
May make this a little easier for you, maybe not. We're not under a time crunch today, but we will be pretty soon. The applications, as I mentioned a few weeks ago, are due the 1st of March. And there's a lot of work to be done to put the applications together after we have our development agreement. And if we assumed we're going to move forward with our project today, that's down the road to get to the development agreement. So in full disclosure, I'm committed to our project in Clinton for a lot of reasons that I've shared with you. When we started looking at this site, part of the reason we looked at the site was because there was no one else interested in the site. Now that you have someone else interested in the site, and given our time constraints, I will in all likelihood start to look for an alternative site so that I'm covered in the event that you choose to go with developer number 2, and we can still proceed with our project. So,
Well, thank you.
maybe take a little pressure off you.
There actually was something
That's good news.
several months ago.
Oh, we didn't catch that, Councilmember Connell?
I said, that there actually was somebody interested in the site several months back. Matt, you'll recall that as well.
Sure.
Before, basically Parcel was putting it out.
Yeah, they were interested, but we couldn't get over the hump. They did not want to do a development agreement with us, and that was one of the requirements we looked at. Yep.
Well, I guess what I'd like to see is kind of helpful if we could just maybe get those matrix back to Matt, and we could bring this back, to really a meeting that could be, maybe not necessarily, I don't know what the schedule looks like for the 2 weeks from now, but it could be the meeting after that, if that gives Matt enough time to get things together.
Yeah, I could, if you guys get it to me over the next week, I could have it ready for the November 24th. That way we'd actually have a decision made at the COW then, and then that way we'd have time and space if it is developer 1, but then we'd also give time and space for 2 to start getting in there and start his project as well. If that pleases the council. So your homework, no. Yeah. And I'll leverage Lisa as well, so when we get those in, I'll print them out so I have exactly what you gave me. And then we'll put a compilation all together and provide that back to everybody. And then you guys can read that, and then we'll let developer 1 and developer 2 bring them back November 24th and slap the table. Is that good, Mayor Pro Temp?
I think so. If anybody has any other questions, maybe just direct them towards Matt, and you can follow up with the developer if there's any further questions back to us.
Gotcha. Yeah. Hey, Lisa, do we need to do the last 2 pieces tonight? I will.
Ideally, so we stay on track.
Okay,
ideally.
okay. Gotcha. Thanks for hanging in, everybody.
I don't think we really need a motion on that, do we, Matt?
No, because what I plan to do, Mayor Pro Temp, is I'll bring it back to the COW on the 24th, and that way we'll highlight, we'll talk about how the scoring went, not with names, but overall how the scoring was, what higher scoring went for what things, and then give an aggregate overall total, so then we can then have the discussion and you guys can finalize. Sorry to keep developer 1 and 2 hanging on, but we appreciate your patience, and I think we're going to get there on this. So, but I think that'll work. You're free to make a motion to direct me to bring it back the 24th if you want.
I'll move that you bring it back on the 24th.
Thanks, Councilmember Shivers.
Second.
Okay, we get that motion, second. Any other discussion?
Nope.
Okay, we will call it.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Councilmember
Yep.
Allison.
Yes.
Peterson.
Yes.
Connell.
Yeah.
Shimmers.
Yes.
Oberon.
Yes.
Mussman.
Yes.
Kearns.
Yes.
Yep. And I'll make sure I fill in any voids that are in that checklist, like TIF timelines, if it's public or private with John, we'll be able to work all that out. So don't send it to me right away. Give me a couple days, and then I'll have you send it in next week, and I'll put those tabulations together. Okay. So speaking of properties, thanks, Chris. Thanks, John, for calling in. I know you did a lot of traveling. We appreciate you calling in, sir.
Okay, thanks, guys.
All right, so this next 2 will go quickly here, but this is basically city-owned properties, 746 6th Avenue South, 719 8th Avenue South, and 729 8th Avenue South. So as you can see here, but this was tax certificate that we got this. It's a bare ground, non-buildable. The neighbors next door have basically submitted a bid for $200 for this. We think is great. I'm going to roll all these together. 719 8th Avenue South. It's also bare ground, non-buildable. Basically, the adjacent owner also submitted an offer for $500 to purchase. And then the third one, 729 8th Avenue South. The city acquired this. Tax cert as well, bare ground, non-buildable, and the neighbor, Don, is that Juiced? Submitted an offer for $150. So basically, these all would go back to the tax rolls. It'd be great, and we'd recommend that the council actually motions to move this forward for all three to.
I'll make that motion, move it forward.
I'll second it.
Okay, motion, second, can we, have any other discussion, or would like to go roll call here?
Roll call.
All right, we can call roll call.
Councilmember Allison,
Yes.
Peterson,
Yes.
Connell,
Yes.
Shemmers,
Yes.
Obrin,
Yes.
Mussman,
Yes.
Kearns.
Yes.
All right. So our final item for tonight. This will take about an hour and 15 minutes. Just kidding. Everybody just laser shot me. I know. So these are all houses or properties that actually have a structure. These were all obtained by tax search, and just for the record, 540 4th Avenue South, 564 1st Avenue, 751 12th Avenue South. We'd like to basically put this out there, and just like we normally do, put them out for bid and see what comes back, and be able to set a public hearing for these three parcels with structures.
I like that idea. I'll make that motion.
Second.
Oh.
Give it to Julie.
Motion and second, any other discussion on this? Hearing none, roll call, please.
Councilmember Allison,
Yes.
Peterson,
Yes.
Connell,
Yes.
Shemmers,
Yes.
Obrin,
Yes.
Mussman,
Yes.
Kearns.
Yes.
Mayor Pro Temp, that is all we have, good sir.
Review this meeting, I think Brooke, that she wanted to do those so she could put in for Realtor of the Year, right?
That is correct. We're trying to find a big enough trophy.
Mayor, council updates?
I have one, the CGI filming is complete, Eastland sent it to us today, it's really nice, very good job.
Good.
I did watch it, it's good.
The mayor wanted to say as he left,
Anybody else there, so I think that's something.
no, just the mayor said before he left, and to leave us in the dust to eat dinner with a great project that could come to town, is that to remind everybody it's Veterans Day tomorrow. And we're going to have at 3:30. Dave's not invited, but we're going to have the State of the City. I'm kidding. The State of the City will be 3:30 for the mayor. And we did cancel the Cornell statue. Mayor thought it'd be best to wait till Memorial Day, as well as Ron. We didn't want to subject the American Legion folks to be out there during this time period. So, but that will be tomorrow. So you didn't hear this from me, but you guys are welcome to come with your mask and heckle the mayor.
Signs.
But it's going to be really good. So we're really excited about it. So that's all I have, Mayor Pro Temp.
Special thanks to all the veterans out there.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Any other council members have any updates?
I'm good. For once, I have nothing to say.
Councilmember Chambers, do you have anything?
I'm good, thank you.
Nothing.
Over? Peterson?
Nothing for Peterson.
Al, Bidwell, and Mussman.
Nothing from Usman.
All righty. I think we are good, so I will look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
I'll do the same my baby's rattle.
Hey, wait, here. That was you. Hey, thanks, everybody. That beta Verado worked pretty good. Cheers.
Pat, did you see my note about when we're going to meet up at the high school? Didn't I send that to you? With that group? Okay. Would you come write down your email address, please?